This presentation is about the conceptualization of exclusion from social relations in later life, which is the key focus of an international research project called GenPath, a life course perspective on the gender pathways of exclusion from social relations in later life and its consequences for health and well-being. Researchers come from Czech Republic, Ireland, Sweden, Israel, Spain, Austria and Norway, and would like to acknowledge the contribution of the work package leaders and co-authors on this paper, printed here on the left-hand side of the slide. My name is Marja Aartsen. I work at OsloMet University in Norway. So for more details about this whole presentation, you are kindly referred to read the article Exclusion from Social Relations in Later Life, which is recently published in Gender and Research, but also can be found online free of access. The argumentation for this paper, but actually the argumentation for the whole GenPath project, is that exclusion from social relations is unwanted. It undermines a healthy, active and independent life. It's disproportionately high for older women, and policies to reduce exclusion from social relations has so far been limited effective. So the aim of this paper is to develop a heuristic model based on theories and previous empirical findings to understand or to come to a better understanding of potentially gendered construction of exclusion from social relations and its outcomes. So when we think about exclusion from social relations, maybe we do not need a very clear definition because we all have a sort of intuitive understanding of what it is precisely. But for example, here on this picture, we have two pictures of people who are, well, can easily be seen as being socially excluded. For example, the woman on the right-hand side, woman lived in the United Kingdom in the previous century, and she lived in the farmhouse of her father, of her parents, and all the family and parents that she was living with were dead or they fled the countryside to live in the cities. So she was sort of left behind with one or two cows and without any money, without any running water or electricity, and certainly without any other people to connect to. Nevertheless, she was a very happy woman and she had some sort of purpose in life. So yes, in an objective sense, certainly excluded from other people, but is that precisely what we understand about exclusion from social relations or not? On the left, we see another couple living in France, also in the last century. This is a different story anyway. He decided at a certain moment to withdraw from society because society has been mean to him in a way. He was accused from doing something that he never did. And therefore he decided to not to live longer in a society that was so cruel. And the woman on the left was the householder of the family he came from. He came from an aristocratic family with a good standing. But he decided to withdraw, and that is also a sort in objective sense exclusion from social relation, but with a totally different content. So the need for having a clear definition is certainly there, as in the example of the two people, there are similarities, but also important differences. So when it comes to research on exclusion from social relations, we feel it's important to be clear about what we understand when talking about exclusion from social relations. So our assumptions for ESR are actually the following. We believe that it is a continuous concept. So people cannot be or are not in or out society. They are not included or excluded, but they can be to some extent excluded and to some extent included. It is also an objective state, as we can talk about a number of relations that people have, but at the same time it's also something subjective, as the quality of the relations is equally important, but it's not something that can be measured objectively. It depends on the perspective of the person who is or feels excluded. And then we feel that it is a multidimensional concept in the sense that it's not only the household, but it's also the wider social network that counts here, and even the wider society. So to be included in society or excluded is also part of our definition. So actually we have the following definition for exclusion from social relations, which we define as a situation in which people are socially and emotionally disconnected from adequate levels of intimate relations, social networks, social support, and or social opportunities. And the last is particularly with participation to society. It's also important to stress here a bit that it's not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is a feeling that is maybe the consequence of exclusion from social relations, but it's not the same. In our conceptualization, we make a strong distinction between those two. So when it comes to understanding the level of exclusion from social relations, we have two theories, or maybe one perspective and one theory that helps us to understand this variation within an individual. So people can go in and out of an exclusion state, but people differ also with respect to other people. So this inter and intra-individual variations rest on two pillars. The one is life course perspectives, originally defined by Elder, or actually this means that we consider conditions, opportunities, decisions in earlier life phases as important factors for current levels of exclusion from social relations. We also acknowledge that the impact of exclusion from social relations heavily depends on what happens in the surrounding of the person. So what happens in the lives of other peoples, but also what happens in the historical time and in the specific place that people live. So we take a sort of holistic life course perspective when trying to understand exclusion from social relations, variations therein. The other pillar, which is more a theory, is the convoy model, originally developed by Antonucci and colleagues. Convoy is the group of people that surround us when we move through the circle, through the life course. We are to a lesser or more extent surrounded by other people, by social relations that moves with us or with them throughout the life course. People can go in and can go out of the life course depending on needs that we have for support, or needs that we have to have contact with other people. But also changing circumstances can change the convoy. For example, people move to another city, then the convoy is in a way reshaped or restructured. Both theories have micro and macro perspective. So it's individual factors that are important, but at the same time, it's the structure or the macro social factors that shape exclusion from social relations. In other words, now we come sort of to this first contours of our heuristic model. Here we say that exclusion from social relation is the outcome, or at least influenced by structural factors and individual factors. So the need for other people, preferences for context, but also the structural factors, for example, the geographical relocation, as I mentioned, or welfare state provisions, equally important, or healthcare, or economy, or maybe even ageistic norms in a society. How do we treat all the people as being part of society or not, and so on. And then we sort of acknowledge also that individual and structural factors are interrelated in a way. And this so being excluded from social relations may or may not affect loneliness or health or well-being, depending on maybe individual factors, but also structural factors. So this is and I will go into detail in this into more detail when I discuss this. So looking at the individual drivers of exclusion from social relations, we, based on empirical studies, find three well, let's call it main categories of drivers. First, we have the conditions, so the psychobiosocial functioning of the individual. That in turn defines the need for relations. So if we are in need for help with household or with dressing and clothing, with ADL things, or if we need to talk to other people about our emotional feelings and so on, that sort of drives the need for relations. If we're totally happy and functioning well and so on, the need is much lower or less pressing, let's say it that way. Then we have our personal standards. So we have expectations of other people, and these expectations can be low, but can be high as well. If these standards are high, then maybe the need for other people is much higher. People do more effort to connect with other people in a way. And then there are life course transitions. So people move through the life course from one role to another. For example, from worker to retiree. That of course influences the need for social relations, or that can induce exclusion in a certain extent. Same with becoming a widower, or becoming a care provider, or becoming a care receiver even later in life. So a change from provider to receiver. So these are three individual groups of individual drivers of exclusion from social relations. And then we found also groups, more like 5 groups of structural drivers. So one is the neighborhood, of course. So if you live in a neighborhood that is really deprived from support systems or safety on the street, which is the next category, sorry. So if there is a deprived neighborhood, people have less contact with other people, or less possibilities to have contact with other people. That disables contact with other people. And then there is safety, so sense of belonging. People can be on the street or not, but also feel belong to a certain neighborhood or society. And then we have already mentioned the ageistic norms, for example. So can older people be part of society, or are they excluded because of ageistic ideas about older people? But also norms and values towards care provision. So is it the social network that should care for older people, or are there healthcare institutions who should do so? And then population turnover is another one. For example, changes in the demographical composition can lead to lower cohesion if there is in a certain neighborhood or place in the country with a high number of refugees, for example, that can be a threat to cohesion, or that can push people out of society in a way. And then, of course, the welfare state's provisions that can reduce inequalities, that can reduce the higher risk for women to be excluded, or that can reduce the consequences of having a low income for exclusion from social relations. And then we sort of acknowledge that these individual and structural factors do not occur in a vacuum, but the effect of individual factors may be amplified by the structure, or buffered by circumstances, or maybe the time in which people live. So welfare state provisions can repair or fulfill the needs of an individual if social relations are absent. So hence we conclude in a way that outcomes of social relations are sort of interplay between individual and microsocial drivers. So here is our final heuristic model, which we also describe in further detail in the article I mentioned in the beginning. So we see that there are individual drivers, which we call conditions, relationship standards, and transitions. We have the microsocial drivers, the neighborhood, safety, norms, values, population turnover, welfare state provisions. These act together in a way. They're mutually reinforcing each other's, and both have an influence on exclusion from social relations. And then, as a consequence, if people are excluded, they can feel lonely, their health is lower, and their well-being is lower. But the strength of these associations can be modified by these macro and micro level drivers, or macro social drivers and individual drivers. So far, I haven't spoken about gender, but we think it's not a single driver. It is rather an overarching cross-cutting factor. So developments in a person's life, for example, the accumulation of advantages and disadvantages, are modified by gender, as well as by age and ethnicity, sexuality, and economic background, but here the focus is on gender. So we believe that gender is a sort of overarching cross-cutting factor. And the whole construction and consequences of exclusion from social relations is different for women and men. So it's not a single driver, but an overarching cross-cutting factor. I now come to the conclusion of this presentation by expressing the hope that this heuristic framework, this heuristic model, provides a useful framework for analyzing the origins of gender differences in the prevalence and generation of exclusion from social relations. Of course, further work is needed to validate the model and to inform policies to reduce the exclusion from social relations in later life. Thank you.